Return to your seats, please. We'll get started with our discussion. And I'll let you. Just raise your hand and we'll get started. Go ahead.
Your brief was very good and gave the other side of the story, so to speak. As I told you, my background, I was vice president of a program in Northrop Grumman where we gave NATO procured 5 blowhogs and with all associated ground stations. And you would think it would be for war, right? And it was to track refugees, immigrants, so that NATO is disseminated out to countries so they compare for what the other side what you experienced, which I thought kind of dovetails into your brief that countries are trying to prepare to take care of it. So my question to you is, has anybody, larger organizations, I know you're doing one for OSD, taken your data, because modeling and simulation helps prepare countries for this onslaught of people they have to take care of initially?
Yeah, so right now the answer is no. We've had the UN office.
Can you repeat the question?
Sure, the question was whether or not any of the countries that are preparing for mass migration have asked or used my data, and how modeling simulation obviously helps people make policy decisions and think about scenarios. And the answer is no. We're working on it. The UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, UN OCHA, they were in contact with us last year because their problem, they have a ton of data about where people live, but their problem was they've been using statistical models in the past to try and predict where people would go, and it just isn't enough. The Congo's been losing thousands of people into the dense jungles of the Congo. So people will be forced from their homes because of civil conflict in various places. And what UN OCHA learned, because these are internally displaced, so this isn't UNHCR, UN OCHA learned that they would be doing operations somewhere in the woods in the jungle and run across 2,000 people who had been living there for months and hadn't had access to any resources. And so what they wanted to know is if we could use their data and build a model to try and at least predict where people might go based on terrain, based on conflicting and hospitable ethnic groups. And so there are a lot of constraints in the Congo that might help them at least narrow down. But so far, the Army's been interested in this type of work as well. And most of them have data, and what they want are the models to try and predict it. And we're still working on that because human migration is very, very complicated. And all of the research so far, statistical big data analysis and simulation research and qualitative research has shown that we're not actually very good at knowing when and why people move. So you would think that a conflict happens and people move, but it's not the case. So as I said before, where like home is home and people feel really drawn to this place of home, it takes a lot in most cases to make anyone leave their home, right? And so conflict proximity is not a very good predictor of movement, right? Economic collapse is not a very good predictor of movement. And every time we think we have it figured out, we get it very wrong because people are so complicated when it comes to actually giving up everything they have. There's a big data project at Georgetown that's been trying to look at predictors of forced migration in Iraq. And one of the things they found is actually one of the best predictors, which seems common sense if you think about it, but we never would have figured out, is they think that if you tracked the number and frequency of real estate sales in the classified ads, that's actually one of the best predictors of forced migration, because people don't want to leave everything they have, but if they're going to, they need some money to fund the place they're going to go. And so they found in Iraq that before massive waves of migration, people tend to put their land up for sale, their property up for sale in the classified ads. And so I don't know that migration modeling is taken. I mean, there are a lot of migration models out there, and none of them are good enough because People are just so complicated. And every time you even think, there's one model that was in Nature and got a lot of publicity, but you have to know the routes that the refugees would take in order to make this mathematical model work. And the problem is, like with places in the Congo, with the places, most of the places in the world, you don't know because they don't know, right? If you ask refugees, well, how'd you get here? A lot of them were like, well, conflict happened, I went left, and then I saw some other people, and they looked like they knew where they were going, and so I followed them, and then I ended up in this place called Rwanda, which you didn't plan to end up there. And so it's very difficult to capture the human decision-making component in a model, but we're trying. Yes?
Have you done anything between South American migration to North America?
Not yet. So we've put in proposals, and we have some data looking at what we call outlier migration, trying to find early predictors of forced migration. So when you think about the Venezuelans, and I talked about how people who have resources moved farthest first, right? The Venezuelans who could have been early predictors of the crisis were the ones who had enough money to pick up, buy a business in Miami and leave. And so one of the things we've been looking about in that direction is about that. But for the most part, we've stayed away from the US southern border, like the north to south migration, because it's so security focused, and there's sort of an ethical component to doing refugee research that's not exactly scientific. And so there are lots of questions I could ask, but I'm not willing to confront the answers to some of those questions. And so I tend to avoid topics that I think are going to be bad for migration in general, which may be controversial scientifically, but ethically I don't want to put out research that I think is going to, fuel detention centers or help us secure a border. And most of the funding for that type of research is in that direction, more security.
Tell us a little bit more about the agreement between the EU and Turkey. And I'm wondering if, in fact, Turkey is now being paid to attend to refugees and keep them. How do we now still have this refugee camp in Lesbos? Are those new arrivals, or are these old arrivals, or exactly how does that work?
So Turkey is being paid, though their argument is that they have not been fully paid for their participation in the EU-Turkey deal. The processing of asylum applications has been incredibly slow. There's a high burnout rate for asylum processing officers, and so they're brought in from all across Europe to work in the Greek islands to process these refugees. So yes, some of them are new, but the wave coming in is much lower. But many of them have been there for several months, some up to 2 years. And the process isn't straightforward, so it's not as if a refugee comes to an asylum processing officer and they, just like here, if the asylum processing officer says, no, this is not a legitimate claim, you need to go home, they have the opportunity to appeal that finding at least one time. It takes money and resources, and it can take several months, and in that time they're generally waiting in the detention center. And so one of the problems is, and I think this is an interesting sort of conflict between culture and politics, is that the Greeks are taking pity on many of the refugees who, by the UN standards, are not considered refugees right now. And so the EU has basically made a blanket statement that says that all Afghans are economic migrants. And that's a weird thing to say if you think about any of the news that's coming out of Afghanistan, right? People are being forcibly conscripted into military forces that they don't agree with. There's all kinds of bombs and killings, and we're saying, no, it's safe. Go home. You don't belong here. And so many of the Afghans are appealing their asylum claims, and that appeals process is taking a very long time, and so they're waiting longer and longer. So a lot of people, the Syrians are mostly gone from the Greek islands. They sort of got a pass by the EU saying all Syrians are legitimate refugees. It's the others who are stuck there. I mean, when we were there, we got detained. It's a long story, but while we were detained, it was great data collection. And my colleague, who is Colombian, we were standing at this place where they took our passports. And he was like, oh my gosh, that person's Colombian, right? Because they're Colombians who have been fleeing various, I mean, they've been IDPs for a long time, and they don't need a visa to get to Turkey, and so it's easier for them to pay the ticket to get to Turkey and pay a smuggler to get into Greece than it is to make the journey northward into North America. So there are a hodgepodge of people being detained on these islands, and because every refugee case is case by case, every asylum officer needs to hear that case, and they're all so different that it's taking a very long time and it's getting backlogged. So administratively, the EU-Turkey deal is in place, and there is a pipeline to send rejected asylum claims back to Turkey, but very few of them have been sent. So I think that answers your question. I'm not sure, but basically, I mean, there's a backlog because of these sort of, are they refugees, aren't they refugees, by whose standards happening.
So that you got released on.
We did get released, yeah. I had a Greek friend who like said a bunch of Greek things, and then they like argued, and then they released us. I don't know what happened. So they did have a picture of my passport though, so next time might not be as good. Did you have a question?
I did have a question. I just want to say thank you though, Dr. Freydenlund.
Freydenlund, yeah.
Thank you, first of all, for your sharing your own immigrant story, and that was wonderful. And obviously, this presentation to me was brilliant, and it was filled with passion and a lot of sadness.
Thanks.
I'm sorry about your friends that you've lost. And so my question is, you mentioned some of the charities that maybe I've given to, and now I'm beginning to wonder if that was appropriate. And so, I mean, I would like to leave here with something. What can I do? I mean, you know, we have Congress. That seems like Congress is going in a different direction. So what could you suggest to any of us from the standpoint of supporting?
Okay, so I have 3 things. My first thing is that when you see someone who is not like you, be nice. I gave this whole lecture when I was in Japan on an exchange this summer because Japanese people are really bad with immigrants, and my thing was, you know, if you want to make a difference, when you see someone who's not like you, just say hi. If they don't say hi back, that's cool, but like, just reach out because people are really struggling to adapt, and they may be really shy, and they don't want to burden you, but just being American and friendly is a big thing. I mean, when you think about all of these radicalization things that we're worried about, and even people here, like radicalizing, people radicalize a lot of times because of isolation, because they feel like they don't fit in. And so the biggest thing we can do is make people feel like they fit in. And the second thing is locally, the Commonwealth Catholic Charities, which is in Newport News now, is our state-run organization for refugee resettlement. So it's a Catholic Charities, but they're actually contracted by the state. They get federal funding to resettle refugees regardless of religion, race, all of that stuff. So refugees who are part of this lottery and they won, they get distributed throughout the United States based on job opportunities. And we get about 300, well, used to get about 300 people a year. These people need all kinds of things. They need people to drive them to the doctor's office. They need someone to come to their home and say, this is what an electric bill looks like, and this is how you know when it's due, and this is how you pay it. People who can, you know, hang out with them and make them feel like they belong here, right? Just the feeling of welcome, like just someone who shows up regularly makes a big deal. You don't have to, have a Ph.D. You don't have to have money. You could just show up and sit with somebody and have tea and make them feel normal. It's Commonwealth Catholic Charities.
So there's a website.
Yeah, you can Google them. They're based out of Richmond, but they have offices all over, and ours is in Newport News. And the third thing is there are lots of sponsorship programs that are good. I mean, the International Rescue Committee is based here in Charlottesville, and they do really amazing work. And so when I say, that they handled the list was saying really bad, that doesn't mean that the work that they did for refugees was bad. I don't agree with their global policies. You can also do like women-to-women sponsorship. I've seen women-to-women programs in almost all the countries I've been to, and those programs work. So, I mean, you could probably talk more about micro-investment, but when you invest in women in their communities, they really do go on to do things, and I think that's a really impactful way too, but that's my personal bias. Yeah.
I'm really interested in the role of just ineptitude as a factor in a lot of things. It's interesting to be fascinating and kind of morbidly because, broadly speaking, international development goes through paradigms, right? In what works in international development. So you go from these large projects, and that doesn't work, so the next paradigm maybe is conditionality, with aid. Then comes the good governance paradigm, which is still kind of with us. On the heels of that, I think we've got the stakeholder paradigm, where it becomes paramount to get local stakeholders involved in these projects. So it's fascinating to me that in Lesbos, these agencies, who were very aware of that paradigm and no doubt believe in it, didn't follow up. Any thoughts on it? Is it just ineptitude, or is there something else going on?
So my thought on that, and this is not anything scientific, you're right. Like when we do refugee work in developing countries, we're actually pretty good at this, right? Like there's a lot more effort now. I don't know if we're great at it, but there's a lot more effort now to do development in communities surrounding them, to reach out, to have buy-in. Part of that is about sovereignty, and in order to operate within a sovereign country, you need to have their buy-in. You can't just burst in and do what you want. And Greece is part of the EU. And so in some ways, their sovereignty is a bit blurred, and they're pretty upset about this because the EU is like, well, you're part of the EU, we own you, so we're gonna do what we want. And I think there's a bit of, it's our backyard situation, and so we're gonna do it how we want. And so they just didn't put a lot of these things into place for whatever reason. Sometimes these things are too close to home to be objective, I think.
Don't you think, my experience with NGOs, sometimes they come in with all the great reasons, but they don't really want to integrate with the community. They have their mission. I mean, my experience is when I was on a ship, we would interact with NGOs. They didn't care that we were there to provide air conditioning while they got set up. I mean, it was like an assumption that the ship should be there for them. So I kind of think if I got from your brief that the people, that the NGOs, and I don't think they're profit making, they don't want to be. I think they just really get overzealous about their mission, supposed mission, and really don't care. Like, you say hi to people and all that stuff, maybe they don't do that. So I think it's kind of like a mindset.
Some of it is, and I think some of it for sure is that the larger the NGO, the more ingrained they become about their mandate and what is allowed within their mandate. So one of the Greeks' complaints was that at one point, the Greek government made it illegal for anyone to transport a refugee across the island of Greece, so from where they landed to the processing center, because that was considered human trafficking. So Greece weren't even allowed to use their personal vehicles to help people cross the mountain, and they weren't allowed to pull anyone out of the water because they were told that that's off limits. And so then the UNHCR had been there, and the UNHCR people would stand on the beach watching people come in, and the Greeks were like, that person's drowning, are you not going to do something? And the UNHCR person would turn to them and say, I'm sorry, it's not in my mandate. Because their mandate is administration. So the Greeks would break the law and go in and get people out, and that's part of what started this. I mean, it's many pieces, but part of what made them really mad about the NGOs. But I do think, like you're saying, when you look to the development sort of plan that NGOs have in places like Rwanda and places like Congo, they have a plan in place to also invest in the local community. And for some reason, there's a different mentality that goes into certain places, and it just depends on the NGO as well, and like who's in charge. There's a large problem with the overarching administration and who's controlling who, especially when you have these little NGOs that pop up and basically have no accountability. So, I mean, I think it depends. But there's something strange about Greece in particular.
So I'm under the impression that Europe is doing quite a bit more for resettlement than we are, maybe in terms of numbers, but it also kind of leads to large enclaves in inside the countries, and that makes sense that you would want to live with a group of people that are, you know, that are very similar to you. I'm curious to hear your thoughts about how what's Europe doing right and wrong in that area in resettlement.
Yeah, so I don't really study resettlement, first of all. I mean, it's a different arc of the journey that I don't, and there's people who specialize in that, and they're mostly people who do social work and counseling that really talk about integration as a whole. I recently did a big data project that was run by a Turkish mobile phone company, and a lot of people presented about this. And one of the things that came out of this, because Turkey's hosting about 3.2 million Syrian refugees, mostly in urban areas. And they said, you know, Syrians tend to live in these enclaves, partly because the real estate is affordable, so they live in poor areas, and partly because they don't speak Turkish, and so it's easier to live in a community that speaks your language. And one of the things that came out of it was, yeah, and it seems a bit scary when they do that, but the next generation of Syrians, the kids, will generally not live in those places. And so it's actually a temporary phenomenon. And I know the Dutch have been dealing with this as well and trying to improve their systems for integration. The Danes actually have a 5-year program that refugees have to enroll in that includes culture, language, all the things. 5 years, that's intense. We give 90 days. And so I think every country's trying out these things, and no one's sure yet. So I don't think there's any consensus, which doesn't give you a good answer to your question. I'm sorry, but I do think there are things to be learned from what they do. There are things to be learned from what we do. One of our strengths historically is that while the U.S. doesn't have these very regimented programs for resettlement, we only give 90 days. Since the Vietnamese refugees arrived, we've been really reliant on faith-based organizations. And so most refugee communities in the United States, for better or worse, I could talk all day about this, but rely on church communities, and that's part of why they're successful. An entire church community will rally around one family and help them integrate. And so even here, refugees tend to be settled in one cluster because we need apartments that don't require deposits. And so it's very difficult to make agreements with these apartments. So once we do, we need to get them all in there. And on purpose, the US tries to resettle refugees where others like them have been successful. That's why you see all the Somalis in Minnesota. It's a weird place, right, for a bunch of Somalis, and they've been so successful, and now they're in politics because they've been successful there. And so it's easier for those Somalis to help the new arrivals assimilate. And I think from the outside, it can seem sort of scary, right? Like we have these little, you know, Afghan towns and like Iraqi towns popping up, but it's generally very temporary, and the next generation of kids go to college. Almost all children of resettled refugees go to college at some point. And so I think it will disperse. It's just right now we're just seeing the immediate wave. Yes?
Well, my name is Charles de Gracias. Since you talked about my country, I'm originally from Rwanda, but let me tell you, so this is a successful refugee story. Is that good? Because you triggered my senses, and I'm crazy too much about this now. Well, my wife and I are originally from Rwanda, so this is you talked about the new Rwanda, but we're from the old Rwanda. So our parents were kicked out of Rwanda in 1959. So this is the first genocide of Rwanda, we call it. So we were exiled, our parents were exiled. So my wife and I were actually born in the refugee camp in Tanzania. So we lived in the refugee camp in Tanzania, and I like your number, because we lived there for 20 years. I lived in the refugee camp. And my wife was, we should say, maybe 15, because she's younger than I am. So, but the success, 20 years, so ask me 20 years in the jungle, I knew how the jungle looked like, how the animals looked like, and the lions were my friends. So, ask me how do I really look like I'm here. So this is really good story for you, and so as a part of the success refugee story. So 20 years later, I went away, I just went away to Kenya, and I meet this American young woman. I was 21, So 20, I just left. 21, this American young woman just wandered in Kenya. And so we meet, she's 19. She just left to kind of enjoy African blah, blah, and do the missions, and then go to university later from Colorado. So Julie meets me. This is why it's so good. This is so as you meet the refugees in the camp, our camp, where the camp you're talking about in Rwanda for the Congolese, you just had to go over the other hill. That's what our camp in Tanzania. So you could see Rwanda, but we never entered Rwanda. Okay, for 20, and of course now we can go back. But Julie, though, look, she says, Charles, you know you should come. She says, I'm so out there. I don't speak really good English. I'm barely learning English. I still mumbo jumbo in it. But she said, you should come to Colorado and see snow. I looked at her and I said, what is snow? And but long story short, she goes back, she writes me a letter, she writes me a couple, she sends me a Bible. I begin to read the English Bible for the first time. I begin to learn English. So, but long story short, with all her hard work and prayers, she invites me to Colorado to meet her family and for her university colleagues at Colorado State University. But long story short, so I'm just running so fast. I just written a book about it. Doctor, we shall talk after. See, maybe we should hear change some stories, because this is high class, really amazing, amazing. Well, when I came to visit, she said, you know, you could go to school here. Let's go around. She's young. So by this time, I'm 23 years old. Ladies and gentlemen, Julie invited me and her family, and they took me to Colorado Christian University. So it's a long story short, once it ran through. I finished the university, Colorado Christian University, and I'm out there. And then I go to Denver Seminary, where I did a Master's of Divinity. And of course, I became a pastor, or a reverend, if you would. 25 years ago, my wife came to Denver. We got married. She ran away as well because genocide in Rwanda was being planned in 1993, 94 to happen, so we couldn't go back. But we picked, so I'm not going to go into all the other stories. We picked a bus from Colorado and we crossed the border to Canada 25 years ago. Canada accepted us as refugees, and so from there I became a Presbyterian minister in Canada. But then 18 years to count already, soon 19, I joined the Canadian Forces. I became a chaplain in the Canadian Forces. Not only did I become a chaplain in the Canadian Forces, but after many years now, 3 years ago, almost 2 years to count, Canada sent me to US. They sent me for the exchange program to work with your Navy here. I'm embedded with the Navy here as a chaplain, working with an American Navy for 3 years, an exchange program. We're about to finish to go back to Canada in July, but I have been deployed with your navies here. It's been absolutely rewarding. So simple words of this kind of incredible journey. So America gave me education. It picked me up from the jungle and gave me education. Canada gave me a country. But here's where Canada happened. Canada sent me back to America to give back. Because every day I'm lieutenant commander, but if you're in the Navy, in the Army, I'm a major. I look after your sailors, your young men and women. In fact, this week, on Wednesday, Thursday, I'm deploying to Rota, Spain, to spend another 4 months with young people, American young people. Well, God sent us here in America. God took us out of America. God brought us back here. So we think now we have a country in Rwanda, but really we go back, but we've never lived in Rwanda. But my wife, when we arrived here, she's also in the service. She can tell her story later, but she looked for a place to volunteer, and she found the Catholic, what do you call it? the Comoros Catholic Charities in Newport News, and she's a translator now volunteer for all the refugees from Congolese who are coming from this camp, and this camp you talked about, and they come to settle in the United States. She takes them to the hospital and goes to translate for them. Ladies and gentlemen, that is it's called a successful refugee story. I just want to give you.
Thank you for sharing that. And I think that, I mean, if you volunteer at the center, you know, like a lot of refugees who came here into the resettlement program volunteer and work in resettlement as well. I mean, I think most refugees who come to our communities want to give back. The man that I showed you a picture of, Emmanuel, this picture was taken in a restaurant in Austin, Texas, because he was lucky enough to get resettled to the United States a few years after I first met him. He originally got resettled to Oklahoma, which he said was terrible, and so he moved to Austin with his sister, and it's a success story in part, and he's an Uber driver and a Lyft driver, so think about that when you're taking your cabs. But it's only partially a success story because the quotas in the United States have become so low that while he and his sister got refugee resettlement status, his mother and his brother didn't. And so every day they visit the visa office trying to see if their family will get resettlement options as well. So it's a partial success story, but he's planning to go to community college, and he's planning to finish school and do something with his life, just excited for the opportunity. I think many, many, many refugee stories are like this, successful.
I just want to add a little bit more comments. It's not a question, it's just a comment. I personally studied international development because it's my heart of these stories you're telling. It's my experience. So it's natural for me to follow human stories and look for solutions from the ground up. What can I do for somebody who just resettled are treated fairly, it's like, at least you're alive today, okay? We may not be alive tomorrow. But the international community is advocating for them. Some of these places you have to understand the realities of what's happening before you actually make them stewards of precious life, because it's sensitive. So what my point is, there's a need to deal with the root causes. All these other solutions are dealing with symptoms. And the root causes, sometimes the root causes are not, they're very hard to deal with because the people who have the money, the policies, or in a position to make decisions, they also benefit from the root causes. So that's, then it's easier to deal with the symptoms, and the symptoms become more messier. So I my apology that I don't have the happy ending note, other than when somebody asks what can we do, really appreciate your answer. Be nice. First thing, be nice, right? And get in touch with what's going on in your community, do your little thing, and then one would add to another. As you said, we're here because we met nice people. I mean, our accent didn't matter, but you meet some people, your accent, it's like, oh, already a big wall. I can't employ you, you may not be so smart. So yeah, let's be nice, let's do what we can do in our part, but understand that these things have a root cause that may actually require us to give up our privileges somehow for somebody else to be better, to have hope, and that's me. Sorry for
And to your point about people not having, the people who don't have much are the ones hosting refugees. Over 85% of the world's displaced live in developing countries. So as much as we feel this pressure in Europe, we feel this pressure on our southern border, it's nothing, really. I mean, it's just a bare blip on the radar. It's plenty of people we could just reach out and be nice to.
I think one more question.
One more question? I think there's one in the very back there.
Thank you so much for the question. First, what would you suggest policy-wise moving forward? Because you say... What would you suggest policy-wise moving forward with the current administration? Because you say US used to resettle about 300 refugees, yet now I don't have the exact numbers, but they have reduced so much. Secondly, some of the camps, I come from Kenya, we have a refugee camp there, they've ended up being breeding grounds for terrorist groups. We recently had a second attack in Kenya. So what would be your suggestion to that? Then number three, I know about CCC because I've also been volunteering as an interpreter. You see it in the refugees' eyes when you talk to them because they're not told the real picture that they are going to meet here. The jobs that most of them work, one of the places is Smithfield, which is like
It's a meatpacking plant.
a meat packing place. So they are not told everything from the ground where they're coming from. As much as the US will need them to pay their air tickets, there are so many other things that they pay for. Even the translation services. Yes, the organization will pay for it, but in the long run, they are all expected to pay all these things. So the real root cause of this problem, I think, lies back at home. Because at the end of it all, we end up in the refugee camps because we fight because of ethnic lines. And if you look at it, we fight in ethnic lines because there are Western influences, like having their leaders, they are puppets. So kind of recycles and there's no solution.
So I don't know if I remember all of your questions now, but in terms of policy for this administration, I don't know what to say. I mean, We went from 75,000, which is really a tiny, tiny number of people that we resettle every year, to right now I think we're at 30,000 is the cap, and we don't reach that, and we're going to knock it down farther, is what I understand. And I mean, when you look at the expectation of radicalization of refugees who are coming to this country, it's so minuscule. I think there's been 3 attacks in the last 10 years. And this is, I mean, these are data published even by very conservative anti-refugee organizations that there have been, I think, 10 terrorists who have been arrested who had refugee status in the US, but only 3 of them resulted in any kind of actual violence or death. 3 in 10 years. The vast majority of our problem actually comes from tourist visas. We're not going to close the door for tourists, right? There's millions of tourists who come to this country on visas, and if you were going to come, it's much easier to come as a tourist than it is to come as anything else. What our real concern is about radicalizing in camps, in places that are far removed from opportunities, from acknowledgement about existence. When we package people in camps away from life and put their whole life on hold, to me, it's an obvious outcome that eventually people radicalize, that they could be easily recruited into militant type groups that are at least promising some sort of change for better or worse, right? It's easy pickings. And so in my perfect world, which is not this one, I think what Peru is doing is really insightful. They're offering 2-year work visas, no promise of citizenship, no promise of lengthening that time, but they're filling labor deficits that they have, which means that refugees from Venezuela who are high skills and some who are not can keep using their skills while they're waiting for their country to resettle. There's a huge amount of global labor we could shift around in forced migrants so they don't have to pause their life. They don't sit in camps waiting for some future. They could get started now. They could get a job in the US and get an associate's degree in 2 years while they're working, right? They could then move on and do 2 years in Europe and maybe finish a bachelor's degree. That, in my perfect world, and I really don't think this is the world we live in, if we could be open to the idea of refugees who have been vetted for their criminal history, if they've been vetted as legitimate forced migrants, and not even by our strict definition of refugees, and give them temporary work visas with no promise of citizenship, I think we could eliminate a lot of this, because I don't know that people want to radicalize. Right? I believe that, I mean, maybe this is me being, you know, all rainbows and butterflies, but I do believe that people want to live a good life and, you know, maybe have children, maybe have a job, save for something that they dream of, and if we could give them mobility, some of the mobility privilege that we have as American citizens to live and work in other places, this might provide, at least alleviate some of the situation. I don't think I got to all your questions, I'm sorry. I'm happy to talk to you later.
Thank you. Thank you. So Larry normally gets to do this, and every week he hands out 2 things. He hands out an envelope with something inside of it that he refers to consistently as very modest. So, you mentioned you wanted a cow. Perhaps this could be a cow. But also you get a Jefferson cup. So this is from Thomas Jefferson. He would give it to all his guests at Monticello as a gesture of respect, friendship, and appreciation. And we very much appreciate you coming today and picking this amazing cup. Thank you very much. That's it for today. We're going to wrap this series up next week with our Mexico-U.S. trade discussion. And thank you again very much for coming out in this bad weather. We'll see you all same time next week.